Florida was once a hinterland in the Spanish Empire, which later became an American backwater with a tiny population that was mostly concentrated in the northern part of the state. That completely changed in the 20th century and is now the third most populous state in the country and a key decider in choosing the American president. To see how that happened, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Florida. Our story begins with Florida's original inhabitants who arrived in the peninsula around 14,000 years ago. For some 11,500 years, native society remained split into numerous small chiefdoms or villages, becoming more settled and agricultural in the north and remaining more nomadic and warlike in the south. In Florida's panhandle, the Apalachee created the most intricate agriculture-based society. They lived in small circular homes with purpose-built earthwork mounds and farmed corn, pumpkins, and sunflowers. Elsewhere in the state, there were the Timucua in northern Florida, the Tequesta along the central Atlantic coast, and the Calusa in southern Florida. The Tequesta seem to have been the first native group to have encountered the Spanish, who had been coming to the Bahamas in slave-raiding expeditions in the early 1500s. That is probably why, when the first officially recorded expedition of Juan Ponce de Leon showed up in 1513, the Tequesta did not engage them, but rather evacuated into the wooded coastlands. The Calusa, however, had no such qualms. They were great sailors and a fierce bunch, whose warriors dominated neighboring tribes, so when Ponce de Leon showed up, it soon turned hostile. After a few skirmishes and the capturing of 8 Calusas, the Spanish left. The Calusa then had to wait 8 years for their revenge, but it finally came in 1521 when Ponce de Leon returned and they killed him with a poisoned arrow. Stopping the rest of the Spanish, however, would not be so easy. The indigenous population was estimated to be over 250,000 when the Spanish showed up in the 1500s, but during the next 200 years their numbers were decimated, and nearly 80% of them died as a result of conflict and disease brought by the Europeans. Many of those who remained were sold into slavery, so by the mid-1700s there were few of the original Florida inhabitants left. As the 18th century progressed, however, European feuds in the north drove tribes like the Creeks and others to relocate into Florida. Once there, the various tribes mixed and intermarried, and eventually also accepted fleeing slaves into their fold. Known as Seminoles, a Creek word that was probably a corruption of cimarrones, the Spanish term for runaways, they would be key players in Florida history in the following century. After Ponce de Leon, there were multiple other Spanish expeditions to Florida, but they all ended badly, including those led by Pánfilo de Narváez and Hernando de Soto in 1528 and 1539 respectively, both of whom saw their leaders die in the attempt. Pensacola, the first Spanish settlement established in 1559, didn't do better. It was destroyed by a hurricane. The French then got in the action and tried to set up a fort along the banks of the St. Johns River in 1564, but it too failed to prosper, mostly because it promptly came into conflict with St. Augustine, a nearby Spanish outpost established in 1565, which incidentally would be not just the first permanent European settlement in Florida, but the whole contiguous United States. It would also be the capital of the colony for the next 200 plus years. Not that it was a particularly prosperous place. It produced little income for the crown and had to constantly fight to keep malaria and pirates at bay, especially the latter, who sacked it more than once. So much so the Spanish had to build a fortress, the Castillo de San Marcos. Begun in 1672, it is the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States. Meanwhile, the struggling Spanish colony nonetheless continued to expand. Catholic missions began to dot the entire northern part of Florida in the 1600s, and in 1698, Spain constructed a permanent military fort in Pensacola. Still, Spanish control over the area was always brittle, and then it suddenly ended in 1763. That was because the Spanish backed the losing side on the 7 Years' War and lost Havana and Manila to the British during the conflict, so to get them back, they traded Florida in exchange. The British then divided the colony into east and west and held on to it for 20 years. They did marginally well, producing indigo, rice, oranges, and timber, but in 1783 they were forced to return Florida to the Spanish, this time as a prize for Spain having backed the winning side of a conflict, the Patriots in the American Revolution. Spanish control, however, remained as frail as ever, and the colony faced constant problems, not least invasions from Americans who often crossed the border to raid Seminole settlements looking for runaway slaves. Soon, it faced self-proclaimed republics in the territory, including the state of Muscogee, a nation founded in 1799 by William Augustus Bowles, a loyalist veteran of the American Revolution, that envisioned the creation of a nation that would unite all the native peoples in the Southeast. It didn't help that the Spanish crown faced independence rebellions in the rest of its empire during the 1810s as well, so figuring it was too much of a headache, Spain sold the territory to the United States under the Adams-Onís Treaty in 1819. Florida became an organized American territory in 1822 with a new capital in Tallahassee and Andrew Jackson as its first governor. As a result, some Seminoles fled to Cuba, while others abandoned their settlements and moved south. But conflict remained between the Americans and Seminoles, not least because as the plantation economy dependent on enslaved labor grew in the territory, Seminoles continued to provide haven for those fleeing slavery. Eventually, the U.S. government forcibly removed the Seminoles west of the Mississippi after neutralizing their leader, Osceola, in 1837. This paved the way for statehood, and in March 1845, Florida officially joined the United States. The union was brief. Only 15 years later, in 1861, the state seceded and joined the Confederacy, more or less for the same reasons that it had joined the United States in the first place, the interest of slaveholders. Florida had few men to offer the Confederacy. At the start of the war, it had only 140,000 people, the smallest population of the southern states, 44% of whom were enslaved. Instead, its main contribution to the war effort was beef. Because of its importance as a supply route, Florida suffered a Union blockade, but there was only one major battle in the state, the Battle of Olustee on the Georgia border. The end of the war brought the dramatic change of Reconstruction, which aimed to transform Southern society and protect the rights of the newly freed slaves. The backlash in Florida, like the rest of the South, was furious. Once federal troops were removed from the state as part of a congressional bargain to decide the contested 1876 election, Florida immediately set up a Jim Crow system which segregated and disenfranchised African Americans in every sphere of life. The Jim Crow system would persist for decades until it began to be dismantled in the 1950s. But legal discrimination was hardly the only problem for African Americans. They also had to worry about the Ku Klux Klan, who thrived in Florida, especially in the 1920s when the state led the country in lynchings per capita. During this period, the state was witness to several massacres, including Ocoee, a white mob attack intended to keep blacks from voting, which left at least 20 dead. And most infamously, Rosewood, where the violence got so bad the town was razed, its survivors left never to come back, and the memory was black-holed for 60 years. In the meantime, by the late 19th century, the northern part of Florida was well settled, with railroads crisscrossing the northern and central part of the state, but the south was very much on an inhabited frontier, mostly swamp. This began to change with the initiative of Henry Flagler, one of the founders of Standard Oil, which decided to build a railroad south along the eastern coast of the state, trying to coax people to come and make him even more rich. It helped that he did it largely through convict leasing and debt peonage, forced labor systems commonly used in the South against African Americans. Flagler's gamble worked. Soon, towns began to pop up all along his line, including Miami and Palm Beach, and creating one of the most spectacular housing bubbles in American history in the 1920s. This, however, wouldn't have worked without another massive effort, the draining of the Everglades. Begun under Napoleon Broward in the early 1900s, over the next 70 years, some 1,800 miles of canals and levees were etched across Florida's porous limestone, causing irreversible destruction of the natural habitat and replacing it with farms, cattle ranches, orange groves, sugarcane, and suburbs. It would take two major hurricanes in 1926 and 1928, and then the arrival of the Great Depression to end the state's first housing boom, but it would hardly be the state's last. Meanwhile, another quintessential Floridian industry continued apace even as the economy suffered: tourism. Visitors looking for sunshine had been coming to the state since the 1880s, including Henry Flagler himself. But in the 1930s, savvy promoters created the first theme parks at Cypress Gardens in Silver Springs. That was only the beginning. After World War II, some of the GIs who had been stationed in Florida returned with their families, leading to a boom in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, Walt Disney began what would become the most visited vacation resort in the planet, Disney World. He did it by secretly buying property along Interstate 4 near Orlando and negotiating numerous legal exceptions so that he could make his resort mostly self-governing. Opened in 1971, before its construction, Florida received around 20 million visitors a year. In contrast, in its first year, Disney World alone received 10 million people. In the meantime, the other pillar of the modern-day Florida economy began to develop: retirees. After the war, Social Security permitted more of the aging middle class to retire in Florida, and they took it up with gusto, especially after air conditioning became the norm in the state in the 1960s. Many came from the East Coast, and quite a few were Jewish. By 1960, Miami Beach was 80% Jewish, creating a famous ethnic enclave. It was also during the 1960s that another important element in the state's makeup came to be: the arrival of Cuban exiles. Of course, Florida had long had an important relationship with Cuba. It was ruled from there during the Spanish colonial times, and Cuban immigrants had been coming to the state since the mid-19th century, when cigarro operations were moved to Tampa Bay and Key West from Cuba. One of the most famous was Ybor City, originally an independent town, now a Tampa neighborhood. It was such an important center for Cuban immigrants in the United States that José Martí, the Cuban independence hero, famously spent time there trying to raise funds for the cause in the 1890s. But the true watershed for Cubans in Florida was the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Before Fidel Castro's takeover of the island, there were only around 10,000 Cubans in Miami, but in the next 15 years, there would be an additional 500,000, most of them white, wealthy, educated professionals who feared the revolution and could afford to leave for Floridian shores. They expected to return home soon, but the Bay of Pigs, a failed 1961 invasion that aimed to topple Castro, put an end to that. Instead, Cubans continued to come to Florida, attracting even ones who were already elsewhere in the United States. The steady flow of migrants became a flood in 1980 when Fidel, in a bid to both embarrass the United States and create political problems for Jimmy Carter, opened up his jails and let any of the prisoners or any other Cuban who wanted to flee the island leave. Known as the Mariel Boat Lift, the effort brought around 125,000 Cubans to Florida, and the foreboding sense in the media that the U.S. was opening up its doors to hardened criminals. The reality was much different, but that didn't stop Scarface's Tony Montana from becoming the most famous fictional depiction of a Marielito refugee. Cuban immigrants completely changed southern Florida, especially Miami, not just linguistically and culturally, but also economically and politically. They made Miami a major business and financial center with deep ties to Latin America and became an important Republican voting bloc. This last part still took a while, since many of the original Cuban exiles refused to become American citizens and were thus ineligible to vote, and even those who could were not necessarily inclined to favor the Republicans. But by the 1980s, they were solidly in the GOP camp. The changes created some conflict with other groups, especially white Anglo-Miami, as well as African Americans, which in turn has shaped local politics since the 1980s. In the meantime, proximity to the Caribbean and the social transformation of southern Florida made it an attractive destination for other groups in the following decades, especially Puerto Ricans, Colombians, Haitians, and Venezuelans, who now make up around 5.6%, 4.8%, 2.4%, and 0.5% of the state's total population. Meanwhile, Florida's geography shaped yet another important pillar of its economy: government spending on national defense. Florida is a state with the third most military bases in the country, right below California and Texas. Given its strategic location close to the Caribbean and later the Panama Canal, the state has some of the oldest military installations in the country outside the 13 colonies, including the Naval Air Station at Key West, established originally in 1823 to fight pirates. This also contributed to an industry adjacent to the military: space exploration. Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center, for instance, were both placed where they were because the spot already had a history as a missile test site for the armed forces, which in turn was used to take advantage of Florida's closeness to the equator and the Earth's curvature. Today, NASA has a huge economic output in the state, over $5 billion according to the agency's calculations. Proximity to the Caribbean has also been a boon for a different kind of business, less welcomed by the authorities: drug trafficking. To be sure, being as it was at the crossroads of various empires, smuggling has a long and profitable history in the state, going all the way back to the late 16th century. Enslaved people, silk, and anything meant to pay an import tax or banned were some of the first products smuggled. Then, during the multiple wars against the Seminoles and the Civil War, came weapons. And later, in the 1920s, during Prohibition, alcohol running, especially rum, became big business. Modern drug trafficking, however, began in earnest during the 1970s, first with marijuana and later with cocaine. Florida offered the perfect landscape for the wholesale transport of illegal drugs for Colombian cartels, since it had a huge coastline within easy access of Colombia and the Caribbean. Even better, the Everglades provided the perfect place to bring drugs into the U.S. away from prying eyes. The success of the route soon had South Florida awash with drug money and rising crime, so much so that it inspired Miami Vice, the crime show of the 80s. By the 1990s, Colombian cartels had been neutralized, banking laws had become stricter to limit money laundering, crime rates began to go down, and the U.S.-Mexican border became the main drug trafficking theater. In the 2010s, however, the Florida drug trafficking route started to pick up again.
With the biggest drug bust in the history of Polk County, a $50 million bust.
A much worse consequence of its geographic location is the frequency of hurricanes. More storms hit Florida than any other U.S. state, with only 18 hurricane seasons without a known storm hitting the state since 1851. The costliest three in monetary terms have all happened since 1992, starting with Andrew and following with Irma and Michael in 2017 and 2018 respectively. Irma was the worst of the three, with an estimated $52.1 billion in damage, especially around the Florida Keys, which were the worst hit. Fortunately, the number of deaths was fewer than had originally been expected, in part because a record 6.5 million Floridians were evacuated, the largest evacuation in the state's history. All of these factors have shaped the development of the politics in Florida. Historically, the Democrats had the control of government. Between statehood in 1845 and 1998, out of the 49 men in the governor's office, 42 were Democrats, 5 were Republicans, 1 was a Whig, and 1 was a Democrat that ended up running under the Prohibition Party label in 1916 and won. In contrast, since then, Republicans have won every single election. The height of domination for the Democrats was right before the Civil War and at the height of Jim Crow. The latter in particular was dominated by the so-called Pork Chop Gang, a group of 20 very conservative Democrats from rural districts in North Florida that took advantage of malapportionment to control the state's politics for decades. With that power, they maintained segregation and investigated people who they thought might be communist or gay in public universities. Their demise came when the Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s upholding the constitutional principle of one person, one vote led to the passing of a new Florida Constitution in 1968, which moved power away from less populated rural areas to cities. The Democratic Party's grip in the Electoral College did not last as long as it did in the governor's office. Between 1880 and 1948, the only Republican that managed to win the state's electoral votes was Herbert Hoover in 1928. But as the memories of the New Deal began to fade, Republicans began winning. Out of the 13 elections between 1952 and 2000, they won 10. 2000, however, was the most infamous of all. In the 1990s, the state had become more and more politically competitive in presidential elections, and in 2000, Al Gore was favored to win the state. Instead, he would officially lose Florida by 537 votes out of over 5.5 million votes cast, a difference of 0.09%. For that to happen, however, first there had to be multiple hand recounts in the state, including that of Palm Beach County, whose massive screw-up of providing voters with a butterfly ballot ended up favoring Pat Buchanan, as elderly voters were confused with the layout and chose him by accident. Even worse, voting was done by piercing ballots, so that when the hand recounts occurred, officials had to interpret the intention of the voter, including in situations where there were dimple or pregnant chads, that is, ballots that were not fully pierced. It was a mess. In the end, the election was certified when the Supreme Court, in Bush v. Gore, decided to stop the recount because there was no uniform standard across the state, and no uniform standard could be come up with before the certifying deadline. A few months later, the National Opinion Research Center undertook a comprehensive ballot review and found that a statewide recount would have seen Al Gore prevail in the state, handing him Florida's Electoral College votes and the presidency. Instead, Bush became president and was re-elected and won Florida once again in 2004. Since then, Florida has remained a key swing state in the Electoral College, remaining closely fought since then and going with the winner except in 2020. That status seems assured in the near term, and thus its importance to American politics. What a term for a state that was once called the poorest country that ever two people quarreled for.